So good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Earth Institute Coffee Morning. This morning, I'm delighted to welcome Grace Nolan, who is a PhD student of working with Adam Kane, and is joining us from Mayo to talk about her work on human-wildlife conflict. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Grace to tell us about her work. Thanks, Grace.
Thanks very much, Taz. As Taz said, I'm here today to talk to you about the media portrayal of human-wildlife conflict, why this is important and why we should be studying it. So just to give you a bit of an introduction to myself, I am a second-year PhD student here at UCD, working with Adam Kane in the School of Biology and Environmental Science. But before I came to UCD, I did my Master's in Conservation Science at Imperial College London, where I focused my thesis on human-wildlife conflict and drivers of tolerance towards dingoes and wild dogs in Australia. But before doing my Master's, I actually worked in public relations, media relations, marketing and social media, which really nicely brings together both my professional experience and my academic background into this PhD topic. So thinking about this PhD topic and my thesis, the media portrayal of human-wildlife conflict, and why is this important? I think that to really get to the crux of this issue, we need to start by thinking about human-wildlife conflict and how we define this. So human-wildlife conflict conjures up images of shark attacks, wolf attacks, lions predating on livestock. It really evokes this imagery of fear and conflict. And we often see narratives that paint wildlife and problem-causing species as antagonizers in this conflict. But when we think about human-wildlife conflict a bit broader, it becomes clear that it's actually a people problem. Anthropogenic drivers such as urbanization and population growth and habitat loss are forcing more and more people and wildlife into closer cohabitation than ever before. Inevitably, this is leading to higher incidences of human-wildlife conflict. And these human-wildlife conflict incidents are felt most largely by those living on the fringes of urban society and engaging in pastoral activities such as keeping livestock. But the effects of this permeate into wider society. And at the same time, we have to consider that fewer people are actually spending time outdoors and enjoying nature. A 2016 study found that children today are almost 70% less likely to spend time outdoors than people in their 50s did as children. And this phenomena, this lack of human-nature interaction, has been termed the extinction of experience. So if people aren't actually having these direct interactions with nature and the environment, how are they experiencing nature? And this is where the role of the media comes into play. So this could be news media or documentaries, nature films, and in the age of the internet, social media. But what we have to acknowledge is that media have become the intermediary for many people between nature, wildlife, and society. The thing is, though, the media isn't always this pure and honest factual medium. It's driven by agendas, and these could be political or economic, but they could even just be down to the reputation of the media organization or a desire to drive entertainment as opposed to really pushing factual news. And whilst the media does, to an extent, reflect the sentiment of the audience they serve, the feeling of the community, these agendas are also really powerful in shaping the opinions, beliefs, and even the fears and the perception of risk that people have. So with agenda setting and framing, it means that we have these often unrealistic and biased portrayals of conflict and problem species. For example, this headline taken from the Irish Sun really focuses on evocative imagery and graphic imagery of deadly bites and even loved ones' intestines. And it's likely driven by an agenda to drive increased readership and entertain audiences. The actual article is more of one of hope and about people coming together to talk about their shared experiences, but that's not what people are dwelling on. And the effect of this is we have human-wildlife conflict and human-wildlife interaction reporting that's really heavily skewed towards the dramatic and sensationalist accounts rather than balanced and accurate accounts. So we need to break down these portrayals as they can be really damaging to conservation efforts, and they heavily influence their audiences and wider society. And they tend to reinforce these fears and this heightened perception of risk. So with human-wildlife conflict being acknowledged as a people problem, we have to develop an understanding of these portrayals and what the motivating factors are behind them in order to understand the broader social ecological system that problem-causing species exist in. And this is really key in order to develop holistic conservation and wildlife management strategies that confront these barriers to intervention caused by particular positive or negative portrayals, and to work with the media to mitigate these and promote coexistence strategies. So this is where my PhD research kind of fits into the story. In order to understand these media portrayals of conflict and human nature interactions, I'm looking at different factors that influence these portrayals. So this can be the purpose of the media, so whether it is news or whether it is entertainment media, and also how geography and spatial scales influence the different portrayals, as well as how portrayals change over time and respond to trigger events. For example, the portrayal of bats in response to COVID-19. But instead of using traditional media content analysis techniques, I'm utilizing the vast quantities of data available to us with the advent of the internet, such as social media posts, digital news and websites. And this is an approach known as culturomics. So this use of big data allows us to analyze thousands of portrayals at once, as opposed to a few hundred max, as in traditional media content analysis. And what this means is that we can use big data and machine learning to really scale up these comparisons across huge, vast temporal and spatial scales. And what we have to remember is this couldn't be done 10 years ago. We didn't have the right technology and the right databases to do this. So it enables us to get a real insight into the portrayal of human-wildlife conflict and problem species at a much larger scale. And as a final product of this PhD, what I'm hoping to do is use the insights from the deep dives into media portrayals to develop a framework and toolkit that can be used to help conservation practitioners and wildlife management professionals to easily break down media portrayals relevant to their systems of interest or problem species that they're working with. So for example, they'd be able to score media portrayals that came out in either the newspaper or on the news, and to identify key areas and key stakeholders and community groups to work with to mitigate these negative portrayals and work with the media to promote positive conservation interventions and counteract these portrayals that cause barriers to conservation and start to see a move towards coexistence. So the first case study of my PhD, I thought I'd take you through that today. And this is a spatial exploration of portrayals of mountain lions across the USA. It's a really interesting topic because we have this species with a wide geographic spread across the United States, but also a history of human-wildlife conflict and persecution. In the West, in states like California and Washington, they're an established population. And then in the Intermountain West region, for example, areas like Oklahoma and Colorado, they're recolonizing their historic range. And then over in the East Coast in Florida, we have this highly endangered and isolated subspecies, the Florida panther. And what's interesting is that these animals have the same capacity for conflict, and hypothetically, they should be drawing similar media portrayals and local perceptions. However, factors such as the political leaning towards conservation in an area or support for hunting in particular areas means that what we're seeing are actually quite varied biases depending on the region and the locality of the newspapers. So in order to break down exactly what these differences are and better understand these barriers to conservation interventions, for example, wildlife passes or hunting quotas and bans, we can use topic modelling to sort these huge quantities of articles about mountain lions into different categories for analysis. For example, when I started this project, I had 16,000 articles, which I've now narrowed down to about 6,000 that are going to be used in the topic modelling analysis. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with topic modelling, it's a machine learning and statistical approach that analyses textual documents and looks for common co-occurrences of words. So this animation helps to explain it really clearly. Documents that then contain these common co-occurrences are then grouped together, and what emerges is groups of documents that belong to the same theme or topic. For example, here we start to see the emergence of environment topics, immigration, space, etc. So in my own project, I'm looking to see outputs coming out from the topic modelling around conflict. But I also want to place this portrayal of mountain lions into a much wider context, instead of just focusing on these negative human-wildlife conflict portrayals. And this means that we are placing these, looking for articles that come out on ecology and science, sightings of mountain lions, and also traffic incidents. So what this means is that we can provide a really balanced perspective on how positive or negative mountain lion portrayals are overall in the media, and then start to compare between the different regions. For example, we might see that, yes, Florida and California have really similar levels of reporting on human-wildlife conflict and attacks on people, but that actually in California, there's a massive push for articles to also be published alongside on ecology and science of these animals to provide a more balanced view. So some of the hypotheses that we're expecting to see come out of this project are that portrayals in Florida will be more favourable than in other regions, and this is due to a considerable conservation push here. Negative portrayals are most likely to be prevalent in the West region. So this is where we have a lot of hunting activity and more prevalent ranching. However, California will show a stronger conservation agenda due to more favourable environmental political leanings. And another interesting thing I'm expecting to see is that the different popular names used for mountain lions, for example, Florida panther or mountain lion or cougar, will predispose the article to either a positive or a negative sentiment. So finally, just to summarise why I think the media portrayal of human-wildlife conflict is so important, is because media portrayals are this snapshot into sentiment towards problem species and conservation. Conservation and wildlife management can only be effective when we consider the entire social ecological system, and the media is a really integral part of these systems. So in order to break down these portrayals, we need to understand how problem-causing species are being portrayed, why they're being portrayed in this way, when these portrayals are happening and whether they're changing over time, and where these portrayals are coming out of, and if there are differences between different regions. And what's really interesting and that we're able to do now is to really utilize all of this data available to us on the internet and use big data and machine learning approaches to really open up the scope of this type of research, which wasn't really possible before. So finally, I'd like to thank Adam Kane, who's been my supervisor so far in this project. And yeah, I'd like to take any questions, and thank you to the Earth Institute for inviting me to speak today.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Grace. Yeah, fascinating stuff. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask? So I think you really kind of highlighted nicely to me the kind of common mainstream media push to kind of dramatize and sensationalize, and you know, obviously that's what kind of sells newspapers, whether they're paper or online versions. Can you see a way forward to kind of break that down, or do you think that's really quite entrenched in the way those kinds of, you know, the red tops, as it were, like the Sun and so on, are inclined to operate? I mean, I guess it happens in TV and stuff as well. I always remember kind of Ricky Gervais saying that Sky TV is full of nothing but sharks and Nazis, because that's what people want to watch. So it's a real dilemma there for the big media outlets. Do you see a way of that kind of just changing somewhat, even if they never change completely?
I think it's about behavioural change and getting journalists on board with understanding why these are so damaging portrayals. And we are quite lucky at the moment that we are seeing a changing tide in the amount of coverage of climate change and the biodiversity crisis, that people are starting to see that we actually need to be protecting the environment a bit more than perhaps they were 10 years ago. It's going to be really hard to get people to stop sensationalizing these attacks and using the drama of it to get people to listen. But I think that what's really important about this work is providing conservation practitioners and wildlife management professionals with the tools to understand why things are being portrayed in certain ways, and to enable them to be able to break down these portrayals and identify who they should be working with in terms of the community, and where that pushback's going to come back at a community level to really start to integrate coexistence strategies.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I had to join a little bit late, so I might have missed some of it at the start, but I was just wondering about the machine learning aspect of it. I've worked with machine learning myself a little bit, and there is, you know, there's this common saying like garbage in, garbage out, you know, the type of comments that you get, but the type of data you put in, and also the methods how you analyze it in machine learning can be quite crucial in terms of what you get out. So I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on that, how you resolve that, or what type of machine learning tools specifically you use to analyze your data, and what the intricacies are on that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm using topic modeling and I'm going to pronounce this wrong now, latent direct allocation, which is a statistical method that breaks down. So I use newspaper articles for this project. So the method that I'm using, it's called tokenizing the articles. So it breaks down all the different words. And then what we can do to stop getting out, as you called it, the rubbish, is we can start to eliminate words that we're not interested in. So for example, I can start to take out what are called stop words. So things like said, the year, the date, and start to get down to then the meat of the articles as it is. And obviously it's a lot of trial and error, and you have to do multiple iterations. But what you start to see is by manually putting in the amount of topics you're hoping to see come out, you can then start to see what articles are being sorted into those topics, and see that, okay, when I have 5 topics that I'm expecting to see come out of this corpus of articles, that actually it's a bit too mixed. So I can then start to increase that up to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 topics, for example, which is then where we start to see a bit more clarity in the different topics and themes coming out. And then something else that I'm doing is I'm using a hierarchical approach. So once I've run the topic modeling once on my corpus of articles, and I've got these articles about conflict emerging, I'm then going to run the topic modeling algorithm again, so that I can start to break up conflict and see what the drivers are. So if that is traffic versus hunting or predation on animals. So, I mean, it's difficult. You have to definitely use a lot of trial and error, but I'm hoping to mitigate that by doing it in iterative stages.
Thanks. Yeah, it's really interesting. Maybe we can chat a little bit more about that at some other point, but thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Augustine, did you want to ask a question also?
Myself?
Please?
Yeah. I suppose, it was a fantastic talk. I'm actually artist in residence in UCD, and I'm also doing another project, a commission for UCC and Aberystwyth University in Wales, and it's looking at biodiversity loss in Dublin Bay, looking at the birds, the seagulls there. And you know, a lot of what you're talking about there, I was looking an awful lot of how in the newspapers in Ireland, the way they dramatized the seagulls and that conflict between kind of seagulls and people. And one of the projects that are pieces that it's coming out of it is that I'm doing creating a sound piece where it's the seagulls kind of rise up against people and go out and say their own side of the story. And we're also creating an eduprop newspaper where the kind of seagulls get a chance to talk back and say their side of the story. So it's kind of going to be a take on kind of everything that from the other side. So I'm really interested in your work there, and I'd love to maybe chat with you at some stage. All right, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess seagulls is closer to home than cougars.
Definitely.
It's also very interesting because that's a real kind of a mixed set of reactions that people have to them, I guess, in much the same way.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because they're not these huge big predators as well. A lot of the time when we think about human wildlife conflict, we do just focus on carnivores and predators, but there's also a lot of conflict with animals like gulls or even herbivores.
So there's a question here from Jane Stevens saying, brilliant talk, really well presented. And what species media relationship in Ireland would you like to improve, as well as seagulls? Of course, are there other species in particular that come to mind in an Irish context?
That's quite a difficult one. So seagulls, obviously, that's something that myself and Adam have actually spoken about quite a lot, is that relationship there. But I think that in Ireland, we've got this really interesting push at the moment towards rewilding, and there's a lot of negative coverage and mixed coverage that comes out, particularly when you talk about bringing animals such as wolves back, or for example, I'm living in a very rural farming community, and if you spoke to some of the community members here about even the reintroduction of eagles into parts of Ireland, then there's a real fear that they're going to cause a lot of havoc with lambing season. So I think it's there's a lot of different relationships that we could look at, but what I'd be really interested in looking at is talking to the community members about what animals they fear, and then seeing how the media could perhaps have a more positive relationship towards promoting coexistence there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess, and those kind of rewilding programs have taken place in other parts of Europe, I guess. Is there anything that we can learn from there in terms of either the media portrayals or the actual kind of the actuality of what's happened as part of that story?
I think one of the things that is important to think about is people's cultural memory as well. So, for example, we're seeing in Scotland at the moment a lot of reintroductions of Scottish wildcats. And while they are a small animal and people aren't seeing that they're going to bring a lot of devastation to their pastoral activities and having wildlife, they're seen as this kind of cultural icon in a way. And that's very different than when you think about talking about lynx. So a colleague of mine at Imperial College, they did their thesis on looking at drivers of tolerance towards potential reintroduction of lynx in North England. And there was massive barriers to reintroduction there. And interestingly, not just from people that were engaged in sort of keeping livestock, but this perception of fear of the unknown as well, which is something actually that I'm really hoping to pull out from this mountain lion project in the regions that are recolonizing, where there is this fear of the unknown because they haven't got this history of living alongside mountain lions, and how the media is picking up on that fear and either trying to mitigate it or really playing on those fears, a bit like we saw with the Irish Sun, the tabloid style headlines.
Absolutely. Any other questions or comments that anyone else would like to make? Yeah, Katie.
Hi Grace, thanks for that. It was brilliant. I'm on the land and ecological restoration course with Maria.
Oh yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I come from a background in global marketing, and I did some work in the past with kind of big data around sentiment analysis of social media, and I was wondering if you foresee, or if you've got any techniques for handling the kind of sarcasm or different things that you might experience in terminology in headlines and the data that you're analysing. Yeah, if you've got any ways that you're kind of going to be handling that.
Yeah, I have to say sentiment analysis is on my to-do list. I haven't done a deep dive into that yet, but I have done a little bit, which was looking at word association with the different names for mountain lions. So for example, cougar versus Florida panther, and the sentiment analysis that you got there with the common occurrences. So for example, mountain lion was much more commonly coming up in articles associated with the word attack, whereas Florida panther comes up with endangered. And some of the dictionaries that you use for sentiment analysis would portray endangered as a negative word, whereas actually in my context, looking at articles, it's actually positive that they're acknowledging that and that they're bringing that knowledge to the public. So it becomes really difficult. And I think that the main example I always think of is on social media when someone says maybe about a concert that was sick, and you're going to say immediately your sentiment analysis says, oh no, that's really negative, but it's not. And I think that we just have to be really aware of how language evolves. And when you are doing sentiment analysis, I think there are ways that you can start to add in or change what the negative or positive sentiment is towards a word. So if there's words that you are going to come up and they're going to sort of confound your results a bit, you can start to make those changes yourself in the code that you're using perhaps. but it is a problem and we do have to address it. And I guess harks back to what Elke was saying earlier, that with machine learning, we do have to take things with a pinch of salt sometimes, and we have to train the way that the algorithms are working.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to chat afterwards.
Sure.
Yeah, that was so interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. And Katie kind of mentioned social media there as opposed to the mainstream media, and I was also wondering about that. I guess it's quite a different construct altogether in many ways. Does it lend itself to these kinds of analyses, or would you approach it in a different way entirely if you wanted to explore its influence?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to include it in one of the later chapters of my thesis, where I'm hoping to do a chapter looking at the change of portrayals towards bats and pangolins over time in response to COVID-19 and zoonotic diseases. And what I think here that we'll be doing is looking at the social media responses on two news articles. So when for example, if the BBC posts an article, what the responses are in the social media, and then how they're shared and the engagement there. And it is very different, but we start to see with social media that it takes on its own presence. So and one thing that happens a lot with social media is people read the headline and they never read the article, but they share it with their own commentary. And I would like to see a way to be able to track that change in commentary almost in a Chinese whispers kind of way through social media. I haven't worked out how to do that yet, but I think that would be really interesting to look at.
Absolutely, yeah. It's kind of a strange thing, isn't it? It's a network of communication rather than just like one person's interpretation of it. And does anyone else have anything to ask or to add? Catherine.
Hey, really great talk. I also do work on like perceptions of insect pollinators and things like that. So I'm so excited about the work that you're doing.
Great.
And one thing I was kind of wondering, you were mentioning about, fear mongering in the media, and that's a huge thing. Like if we all remember what happened with the murder wasps incident, people were like very into sharing that because it was like this scary thing. So in terms of sort of changing the way that the media talks about these maybe more problematic species, what would you sort of suggest, maybe just in your opinion, as sort of incentives for these media outlets to not go the fear route? And what would be like another strategy that would maybe even bring in readership, but maybe promote a more positive outlook of some of these species?
I definitely don't have the answers to that at the moment. I think one of the major things is to really strengthen relationships between scientists and people working in this sort of human wildlife conflict area with the media. It's very common that an incident happens. For example, there is perhaps an attack on a child, for example. It gets a lot of coverage, and the media, they're against deadlines as well, we have to remember, and they're just going to get out something that's going to please their editor and please their audience and to give them the news. But we have to be a bit more preemptive, and I think that the scientists and conservation professionals, the experts in these different systems and problem causing species, I should say, they need to start to develop these strong relationships with the editors at these different news outlets, and perhaps find out if there is someone that tends to be the person that reports on human wildlife conflict, or to build relationships with the science and ecology reporters and environmental reporters, people that are working on those beats, so that we can start to get them to have that relationship where they come to you first and say, hey, I've got this article, I'm going to publish it. Do you agree? Is there anything you can add? Even if it's just to get a scientist comment, because at the end of the day, for them, having a source that is reputable, it helps to bolster their reputation in their industry as well. But it's difficult. It's not going to be overnight.
Definitely, but awesome. Thank you so much. I know, I think it's that really reactionary sort of element of media where it's like you don't talk about sharks until there's an attack, and yeah, changing that is definitely going to be
and
important.
In the age of the internet, you have to have a story out immediately. It's not like where you'd have until the next newspaper went to press. It's 5 minutes to get a story up there, so it's a challenge, definitely a challenge.
Definitely. Well, thanks so much, Grace.
Thank you.
Tom Bolge is asking the question from a slightly different perspective in terms of whether you have plans to look at the coverage of species which have a generally positive press. So I guess that's less kind of conflict and drama and instant news, and more of a slower burn.
Yeah. So what I'm hoping to see, and it's not looking at species in particular that may have these positive press, but it would be, for example, in my mountain lion project in Florida, we are expecting to see positive press, and using that as a comparison point to then look at the West and the Intermountain West Range, because it is this, there has been a push for sort of since the 1980s to really conserve this endangered animal. And again, there's a chapter I'm hoping to do as part of this PhD, which looks at bats and pangolins and their portrayal as a response to COVID-19. And I think what we'll see here is a lot of negative press immediately, but then that will start to change to positive press, particularly pushing conservation, particularly around pangolins, where we have a massive wildlife trafficking problem at the moment as well. So I don't have any plans to look specifically at positive press in the scope of this PhD at the moment, but I do think there'll be incidences where we start to see the positive press emerging.
Brilliant. Killian. Yeah.
Hi, Grace. Really enjoyed that. I was just wondering if you're going to be looking at different media responses across like different geographic regions in the world. I suppose after the whole Harry and Meghan thing and the tabloid culture in the UK and Ireland, would you be looking at media responses to attacks and how different media sources would report it across the world? Yeah,
definitely. It's not for this first chapter with the mountain lions, but definitely I think it's something to integrate into the chapter on the COVID-19 response. For example, there we've got people in the UK probably have a slightly more positive view of pangolins and bats because they don't tend to live alongside them in the same way that people in other areas of the world might. And I also think that we see, for example, there was the culling of, I think it was the mink in Denmark as a response to COVID-19 as well. And there was a real outcry of almost horror in the UK from that, because it was an animal that we're not farming on our own shores in the same way. Eventually it did sort of come out that there were farms in the UK, but it was really different reactions, whereas people living in that community are scared that they're going to feel these effects firsthand a lot quicker. So I think that there definitely is scope. As I said, it's early days still. I haven't really completely planned out exactly where I'm taking the next chapters. I know the sort of overall themes, but it's something definitely to look at and consider. And I think it's important for that final chapter, this toolkit of understanding how portrayals happen. So at some point, I hope to be looking at it from that broader perspective, especially with the tools we have now.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. So really fantastic talk. We're out of time, Grace. So you've generated a lot of interest there, and it sounds like there are several nice conversations that might continue afterwards. So if anybody does have any other questions or that they'd like to reach out to Grace, I'm sure she'd welcome your contact. And she gave the contact details on the slides. I think the talk is recorded, so those details are available they'll be posted soon on the Earth Institute website. So you're able to get access to that information. So thanks again, everybody, and thanks again, Grace. It was a really fascinating talk, and I look forward to seeing how your work develops.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. Really enjoyed it.